Just a nurse. That's what Dr. Hargrove had said the first time she questioned his orders. Not to her face. To the residents during rounds, loud enough for the hallway to hear. Just a nurse. 3 years she'd been at Mercy General in Denver, moving through the ICU corridors like someone who'd learned to exist in spaces where people were breaking apart, and in 3 years she'd heard those words, or variations of them, exactly 47 times. She didn't count them. Her brain did. The same brain that processed threat assessment faster than most people processed conversation, that mapped exit routes the moment she entered a room, that still woke her at 0300 hours with adrenaline spiking because a sound too much like distant mortar fire had rattled her apartment windows. Brooke Sullivan clocked in at 2,247 hours on a Wednesday night in March, her scrubs the color of faded sage, her ID badge clipped to a lanyard that had been washed so many times the military insignia barely registered anymore. She'd worked night shift for 36 months straight, a deliberate choice. Fewer questions. Fewer people. Fewer reasons to maintain the careful fiction she'd constructed around herself. Her file said she'd relocated from San Diego for a fresh start. Her co-workers assumed nursing burnout. Her family believed a desire for quieter work. None of them knew about the boots under her bed, worn through at the heel from thousands of kilometers of desert patrol, the leather creased from movements she'd drilled into muscle memory 2 decades ago. The ICU smelled like antiseptic and floor wax and something underneath, the particular smell of people whose bodies were failing them, a metallic tank she'd learned to metabolize the way other people learn to ignore traffic noise. She passed through the nurse's station without making eye contact with the evening shift, her breathing steady and controlled. This was a technique she used before interactions that might demand composure, in through the nose for 4 counts, hold for 4, out through the mouth for 4. The VA hospital in San Diego had taught her that trick, back when she'd first understood that her nervous system had been rewired by 2 decades of environments where sudden sounds killed people. 3 new admissions had come in during the day. Her assignment was the paralyzed veteran in 412, Marcus Webb, age 34, transferred from VA rehab after a spinal cord injury from an IED blast in 2019. Brooke moved to his room with the kind of efficiency that looked effortless to people who didn't understand that every movement had been chosen, that she positioned herself with her back to the corner and her line of sight clear to both the door and the monitor, that these weren't habits anymore, they were the architecture of how she existed in space. The chart said paralyzed from the waist down. C6 incomplete. The chart also said his vitals were stable, his pain management was controlled with a rotating protocol of fentanyl patches and oral gabapentin, and his psychological evaluation had cleared him for continued rehabilitation. The chart was efficient and precise and told her nothing about the way his hands gripped the blanket or the tension in his jaw that suggested he was counting his breaths the same way she was counting hers. She checked the 4-line first, it was patent, the saline flowing at the correct rate, no signs of infiltration. She worked quietly, not from deference but from respect. This was another skill from 2 decades ago, the ability to move through a space without announcing yourself, to complete tasks with a kind of precision that made noise seem almost disrespectful. Her hands moved over the monitors and equipment the way a pianist moves over keys, muscle memory translated into medical competence, and she didn't notice her left hand trembling until she was drawing up the nighttime medications. Subliminal. Invisible to anyone not looking directly at her. She steadied it by gripping the medication cup tighter and continued working. The vital signs were textbook normal. Blood pressure 118/76. Oxygen saturation 97% on room air. Heart rate 64, steady. Temperature 98.2. The monitor beside his bed painted a landscape of someone whose body was functioning with mechanical efficiency, which meant nothing and everything. Brooke had seen people with perfect vital signs 5 minutes before they crashed. She'd seen organs fail silently and fast, and she'd learned to read the things that didn't show up on numbers. "Your foresight looks good," she said, her voice keeping to the register she'd perfected over 36 months, professional, calm, devoid of the register that lived underneath, the one that gave orders in rooms full of gunfire. "No pain right now." Marcus Webb's eyes tracked her movement with the kind of awareness that suggested he was doing the same threat assessment she was, reading her space, measuring her competence. "No," he said. "No pain." She nodded and made a note in the digital chart, and that's when something pinged in her recognition center. The shape of his face. The particular geometry of his cheekbones. The way his eyes focused, not with the dull acceptance of someone recently paralyzed, but with the sharp intensity of someone trained in tactical assessment. She pulled up his file on the computer, her fingers steady on the keyboard, and read the first line of his deployment history. 2005 to 2014. Helmand Province. 3 tours. Multiple combat injuries including. The room tilted slightly. She gripped the edge of the desk, and her breathing exercise became less meditation and more necessity. There were 7,000 Marines who deployed to Helmand Province across those years. Thousands of them. But the way he held his shoulders. The way his pupils dilated slightly when she moved, not from fear, but from recognition of threat. She'd seen that look in mirrors for 20 years. She looked at his deployment photo clipped to the file. Age 23 in the photo. Clean-shaven. Eyes that had already seen things that change the way light reflects in a human face. And underneath that, a childhood photo from his social work file. Age 8. Kandahar Province. Brought to a medical clinic with a shrapnel wound to his left shoulder. Treated by U.S. Special Forces medic. Released to maternal grandmother's care after Brooke Sullivan had carried him out of a building that was collapsing at 08 for 7 hours on a Tuesday morning in September, his small frame tucked against her body armor, her hands locked around him while mortars walked patterns through the streets behind them. She'd carried him to the clinic herself because she didn't trust anyone else to keep him still enough that the wound wouldn't open further, and she'd held his hand while the medic cleaned out the shrapnel, and she'd given him a protein bar from her pack and told him in Pashto that he was going to be fine, that she'd come back for him if his grandmother couldn't take care of him, that he was the bravest 8-year-old she'd ever seen. She'd never gone back. The deployment had ended. She'd come home. She'd tried not to think about 1,000 faces from that place, and it had almost worked, until she was reviewing a chart at 2,307 hours on a Wednesday night in Denver and found one of those faces looking back at her from a hospital bed. The tremor in her left hand started again. She kept it still by keeping it busy. She updated his full log. She checked the pump rates on his medications. She adjusted the temperature on his blanket with movements that looked casual and precise. Her hands had been trained to hold together things that were falling apart. They knew how to function when her mind was fragmenting. "Get some rest," she said to Marcus Webb, and her voice came out in the register she'd been practicing, the one that belonged to a nurse, not a senior chief petty officer. "I'll be monitoring you all night." He nodded, and something flickered across his face, not recognition, but something close to it. The way someone looks when they're standing next to a familiar echo. Brooke was heading back to the nurse's station to review the rest of her assignment when Dr. Hargrove emerged from the direction of the residence lounge, his presence preceding him like a pressure change in a room. He was in his early 60s, with the kind of posture that came from decades of assuming that spaces reorganized themselves around his priorities. He'd worked at Mercy General for 24 years. He'd never called her anything except her last name. He had the particular arrogance of someone who'd never once questioned whether his competence matched his confidence. "Sullivan," he said, and his tone was the kind that made statements into imperatives. "Room for 12. "Yes, sir," she said. "He's stable. Vitals are normal. Pain management is." "I'm aware of his pain management protocol," Hargrove interrupted. He was taller than her by 3 inches, and he used that fact the way a blade uses gravity. "I'm reducing his fentanyl patch from 50 micrograms to 25. He's becoming dependent. I want him off opioids completely in 3 weeks." Brooke felt her left hand start tremoring again. She locked it into her pocket. "His C6 incomplete is causing him significant discomfort during physical therapy. The current protocol is helping him tolerate his rehabilitation schedule. Reducing it by 50% might compromise his engagement with his treatment plan. The room was quiet. The ventilator in 412 wheezed its mechanical rhythm through the open door. Hargrove's expression changed, not to anger, but to something sharper. Something that looked like he'd just noticed that she was moving her mouth with an assumption that her words mattered. "Are you questioning my medical decision?" he said. "Not a question. A test." "No, sir," Brooke said. She kept her voice in that careful register, the one that made herself smaller. "I'm documenting my professional assessment for the record. That's protocol." His jawline tightened. He looked at her the way someone looks at a calculation that's refused to resolve the way they expected. "Document what you want. The patch gets changed tomorrow at 0600. Confirm it in the system." He walked past her toward the supply room, his footsteps precise and heavy, and Brooke stood at the nurse's station with her hands locked around the edge of the desk, not trembling, not breaking, just counting her breaths and thinking about an 8-year-old boy with shrapnel in his shoulder and the way his grandmother's hands had been too old to hold him steady. She'd buried 20 years under 3 years of night shifts and studied composure and a pair of worn combat boots that she kept in a box under her bed because throwing them away would have meant accepting that she'd actually left that life behind. But that wasn't the worst part of what was about to unfold at Mercy General. The morning shift change at Mercy General began like most others, fluorescent lights humming their mechanical prayer, coffee makers gurgling in the staff lounge, 12 nurses and 3 residents clustered around the assignment board like they had somewhere important to be. Dr. Hargrove stood in the center of them, wallet already open, voice pitched loud enough to carry. "I'm making a public wager," he announced, pulling out a $50 bill and holding it up to the light as if the money itself proved something. "Sullivan quits within a week. I'm betting she can't handle real medicine." The laughter rippled through the lounge like a contagion, not cruel laughter, but the kind that comes when someone in power says something everyone believes they're supposed to find funny. 3 of the nurses glanced toward Brooke, who stood by the coffee maker adding creamer to a cup with the same precise movement she'd used to check a patient's vitals. 1 measured breath. That was all she took. She said nothing. She didn't need to. The nickname started that morning and crystallized by afternoon. "Sweetheart, I need those labs," Hargrove would call across the unit, the word sharp as a scalpel. "Sweetheart, you're behind on your charting." By day 3, the word had become a weapon he wielded with surgical precision, not loud enough for a formal complaint, not quiet enough to miss. The other staff members began to notice the pattern, but they said nothing. Institutional silence is a kind of agreement. Brooke continued her rounds with the same composed efficiency, checking fluid levels and monitor readings, adjusting pain medications with hands that never shook, eyes that never wavered. Her scrub stayed immaculate despite the 12-hour shifts. Her badge hung straight. But there was something harder about her now, something that made the younger nurses step slightly to the side when she passed. Something that reminded them, without words, of the difference between competence and resilience. 3 days into the campaign, it escalated. The cafeteria at midday was crowded, enough witnesses that what happened next would ripple through the entire hospital within an hour. Brooke sat alone at a corner table, as she always did, eating methodically, turkey sandwich on wheat bread, minestrone soup in a paper bowl, a bottle of orange juice. Her posture was perfect, her attention on the food, her composure a wall that nothing seemed capable of breaching. Hargrove approached with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Sweetheart, you're in my seat," he said, loud enough for the nearby tables to hear. Brooke began to stand, not because he'd asked, but because standing prevented what came next from being entirely comfortable. His backhand came up with the casual violence of someone who'd never experienced consequences, and her tray went flying. Soup splashed across the floor in a spreading dark stain that looked almost like blood. The sandwich landed face down on the tile. The juice bottle rolled under a neighboring table. The room went absolutely silent. Not the silence of shock, but the silence of people holding their breath, of witnesses deciding whether they'd actually seen what they just saw. Brooke knelt down. Her movements were unhurried, economical, the movements of someone picking up debris in a war zone, where haste attracts attention and attention attracts worse things. She gathered the sandwich, the bowl, the scattered napkins. A nurse at the adjacent table offered paper towels without speaking. Another stood and moved away, as if proximity to the situation might implicate her. 30 staff members watched as Brooke wiped minestrone soup from her scrubs with a paper napkin, the antiseptic smell of the hospital mixing with the sharp tang of tomato and garlic. She rose, holding the ruined lunch and the empty tray, and something happened to her face, something small enough that only someone trained in observation would have caught it. A single tear escaped her left eye, running a thin trail down her cheek. Not a tremor. Not a crack. Just a tear, like the body's honest response to humiliation when the mind refused to give it any other outlet. She met Hargrove's eyes and wiped the tear away with the back of her hand without breaking his gaze. When she spoke, her voice came out level and calm, the kind of still water that runs over stone for centuries without making a sound. I've picked up body parts under mortar fire, your disrespect doesn't even register. She turned and walked to the trash, disposed of everything with methodical precision, and exited the cafeteria in silence. The room remained quiet for exactly 3 seconds. Then the ambient noise resumed, conversations restarting like someone had toggled the volume back on. But something had shifted. Hargrove stood alone at his table, smile still in place but something uncertain flickering behind his eyes. He'd pushed, and she hadn't broken. He hadn't gotten the satisfaction of watching her crack, of winning the public acknowledgement that she wasn't equipped for this job, this hospital, this life. That would matter later. That would make him accelerate his timeline. The next morning, the humiliation entered its strategic phase. Hargrove was already moving through his network before the morning shift briefing concluded. During ICU rounds with the entire medical team present, Brooke included, standing at the foot of Marcus Webb's bed, monitoring his oxygen saturation and checking the morphine pump settings, Hargrove held up a patient chart like it was evidence at trial. Sullivan, he called out, his voice carrying that false casualness that masked calculation. The entire team looked up. He didn't walk over. He threw the chart, and the cardboard binder splayed across the tile floor with a sound like something breaking. Paper scattered across the ICU, mixing with the sterile environment and the steady beep of 4 different monitors. Pick that up, sweetheart. Or are you too good for basic chart organization? His smile was wide now. This wasn't about a chart. Everyone in the room knew it wasn't about a chart. This was about power, about establishing hierarchy, about forcing her to acknowledge his dominion in front of people whose respect he valued. Brooke took one measured breath. She moved toward the scattered papers with the same unhurried competence she brought to everything, not rushing to please him, not moving slowly to defy him, but moving with the precision of someone who understood the task and executed it without emotional contamination. She gathered the chart, verified that the pages were in order, checked that nothing had been damaged, and returned it to Dr. Hargrove's hands with her eyes level on his. Chart updated and filed, Doctor, she said quietly. Her voice was like still water indeed, no tremor, no anger, no submission. Just statement of fact. The morphine pump continued its quiet mechanical rhythm. Marcus Webb's oxygen saturation held steady at 94%. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, oblivious to the power dynamics being performed beneath them. That night, after her shift ended at 7 in the morning and she'd completed her charting notes, Brooke drove home to her apartment in northeast Denver, a small one-bedroom on a quiet street where nobody asked questions and nobody needed to know who you'd been before you arrived. The morning air carried the smell of fresh asphalt and distant rain coming down from the mountains. She showered, changed out of her scrubs, and sat on the edge of her bed in clean clothes, staring at the floor. Under the bed, in a cardboard box marked storage in letters that had faded to illegibility, sat a pair of worn combat boots. The leather was creased from thousands of hours of wear. The laces were frayed at the ends. The soles bore the scars of impact, a gouge on the left heel from a fall in Kandahar, a burn mark on the right toe from a close extraction in Sanjan Valley, Helmand Province, where mortar fire had come down so thick it felt like the sky was collapsing. She reached down and pulled the box out just far enough to see them, to feel the weight of their presence. These boots had walked through 17 countries. They had carried her through 5 deployments. They had stood in places where the ground itself seemed to remember violence. She'd kept them for 3 years, unable to throw them away, unable to look at them for more than seconds at a time. They were the only physical thing that proved who she actually was, Senior Chief Petty Officer Brooke Sullivan, not just a quiet nurse in Denver who collected 12-hour shifts and avoided conversation. She pushed the box back under the bed and lay down on top of her covers, listening to the apartment settle around her, listening to the city wake up outside her window. What she didn't know was that Dr. Hargrove had already made his phone calls. That Patricia Morehouse, hospital board member, was listening to his careful description of concerning patterns of insubordination. That her nursing school records in Pittsburgh were already being requested. That an external consultant named Rachel Chen, who specialized in documentation for staff termination cases, had already been booked for a 2-shift observation period starting tomorrow. The machinery was in motion, moving with the inexorable precision of institutional power. And Brooke Sullivan, lying in the dark with a pair of combat boots under her bed and a secret that weighed more than everything she'd left behind, had absolutely no idea that the worst part was still coming. The night shift at Mercy General had its own rhythm, a slower pulse than the chaos of day rounds. Fluorescent lights cast everything in a pale wash of clinical blue. The 3rd floor was nearly silent at 2 in the morning, the kind of silence that only hospitals had, where quiet didn't mean peace but rather the absence of crisis, a temporary ceasefire before the next emergency arrived. Brooke moved between rooms with the measured efficiency of someone who had learned long ago that wasted motion was wasted energy. Her scrubs were still crisp from the start of shift 5 hours earlier. Her badge hung at her sternum. At her locker back in the break room, a pair of worn combat boots sat untouched in the darkness, a weight she couldn't let go of and couldn't bring herself to look at. Marcus Webb's room was at the end of the corridor, room 347, and she'd checked on him at 1:15 a.m. when he'd rung the call bell for water. He'd been sleeping better since they'd adjusted his positioning, elevated at 30 degrees to reduce the fluid accumulation in his lungs, the paralysis from the spinal cord injury at T6 making every position a careful calculation of gravity and healing. She'd noted his oxygen saturation at 96% on 2 liters through nasal cannula. Stable. Calm. The sort of patient update that meant the night could continue without incident. But at 2:38 a.m., exactly, his monitor alarm shrieked. Brooke was 16 feet away, charting at the nurse's station, and she moved before the second beep. Her legs moved. Her hands were already moving. Years of muscle memory didn't wait for conscious thought. The monitor strip showed what she already knew from the alarm pattern: his oxygen saturation was falling. 96, 91. 86, the numbers dropped like a stone down a well. She was in his room in 4 seconds. The door pushed open with the side of her hand, preserving what little sterile protocol remained. Marcus was awake, his face pale, his chest heaving with the terrible work of breathing, his body trying to expand lungs that wouldn't expand. His lips had a faint blue tint at the edges, cyanosis, the body's signal that oxygen wasn't reaching where it needed to go. His hands were clawing at the sheets. "Marcus." "I'm here," she said, her voice level as still water. She was already assessing, her eyes cataloguing, the breathing pattern: too rapid, too shallow, asymmetrical rise and fall in his chest. The right side wasn't moving. That was the answer. That was the problem in the space between one heartbeat and the next. Tension pneumothorax. Air trapped in the pleural space on his right side, compressing his lung, pushing against his heart, collapsing his physiology with the relentless pressure of atmospheric gas with nowhere to escape. At this rate, cardiac collapse in minutes. Minutes. Maybe less. "Get Dr. Peterson." Now, Brooke said to the nursing assistant who had appeared in the doorway, eyes wide. But she wasn't waiting for that to happen. She wasn't waiting for the attending physician currently in Surgical Bay 3, 20 minutes away minimum. She wasn't waiting for the on-call doctor who was 45 minutes from the hospital. She was moving to the crash cart, and her hands were already opening the emergency supplies with the precision of someone who had opened them under conditions far worse than a quiet Denver hospital room. Brooke, wait, Rachel Chen, the other night shift nurse, was in the doorway now. "The doctor should." "Will be too late," Brooke said. The words weren't cruel. They were simply factual. Pain was information. Urgency was information. And information said that Marcus Webb was dying in front of them, and she was the only person in the room with a hands-on experience to stop it. Her hands knew the location already. Second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. A point on the chest she'd found hundreds of times, most of them under conditions where missing meant more than paperwork and administrative review. The 14-gauge catheter felt familiar in her fingers. The needle felt right. She prepped the site with an alcohol wipe in one smooth motion, her movements carrying the terrifying fluid precision of someone who had trained until her body could do this without consultation from her conscious mind. Marcus's eyes were wide, and for just a moment, one moment, she met them. She saw the recognition there, the understanding that he was in the hands of someone who knew exactly what they were doing, even if the institution around them would later pretend that knowledge was a violation. She inserted the needle. The hiss of air escaping was immediate and sharp, a sound like someone releasing pressure from a tire, like the exhalation of something that had been trapped too long. The sound of survival, though neither of them would say that out loud. His oxygen saturation began to climb immediately. 82, 87. 92, color returned to his lips. His breathing deepened, became easier, the terrible heaving replaced by something that resembled actual respiration again. Good. Very good, she said quietly, and it was hard to know if she was speaking to Marcus or to herself or to the muscle memory that had just pulled him back from the edge of collapse. The attending arrived 7 minutes later, Dr. Patricia Morehouse, sharp and competent and immediately assessing the decompressed pneumothorax and the stabilized patient and the documentation that Brooke had already begun filling in with her precise handwriting. Dr. Morehouse read the situation in the room the way trained physicians did, the chart, the patient's improved status, the setup of the procedure that was textbook in its execution. Needle decompression, she asked, not to confirm but to verify the timeline. 2:27 a.m. Oxygen saturation dropping rapidly. Tension pneumothorax diagnosis was immediate. Patient would have arrested within 2 to 3 minutes, Brooke said. The words were flat. Professional. The kind of report a senior-level nurse with field experience would give to a physician who needed the facts without narrative or apology. Dr. Morehouse nodded, and something in her eye shifted, a recognition of competence, an understanding of protocols stretched beyond their standard application to save a life. She didn't say anything about the procedure being outside normal authorization. She simply began the next steps, chest X-ray to confirm, call to cardiothoracic, preparation for likely chest tube placement in the operating room. The machinery of institutional medicine moved forward, accepting the foundation that Brooke had just laid down. By the time the morning shift arrived at 6 a.m., Marcus Webb had been moved to the operating room. His collapsed lung was being managed by people with the full weight of the hospital behind them. The crisis had transformed into something manageable, something that could be followed by committees and protocols without the ticking clock of minutes before cardiac arrest. But Dr. Hargrove received the incident report at 6:17 a.m., and his response was immediate. He read it twice, and then he smiled. Not the thin smile of someone pleased by good news, but the predatory smile of a man who had been handed exactly what he needed. A breach of protocol. An unauthorized procedure. Insubordination in its most visible, most provable form. She had saved the patient's life in a manner that transcended her job description, and that transcendence was his weapon. He made the first call at 6:22 a.m., to Patricia Morehouse, from his office before he'd even removed his jacket. Did you authorize the needle decompression Sullivan performed on Webb at 2:06? No, Morehouse said. Her tone was careful, measured. But the pneumothorax was immediately life-threatening. Her procedure was appropriate under emergency circumstances. Standard emergency medicine protocol. Standard protocol is to wait for physician authorization, Hargrove said, and the line between them hummed with the distance of institutional hierarchy. I'll be opening a formal investigation with HR. Thank you for confirming the procedural violation. He didn't wait for her response before hanging up. The next call went to the State Nursing Board at 6:35 a.m. I'm reporting a serious breach of licensure standards by one of our nurses. Her name is Brooke Sullivan. She performed an invasive medical procedure, a needle decompression, without physician authorization or oversight. He let the silence sit for a moment before continuing. I have documentation of a pattern of insubordination, questioning physician orders, and now unauthorized medical procedures. This requires immediate investigation. By 7 a.m., he had called Patricia Morehouse again to request a formal incident review. By 8 a.m., he had pulled Chen's previous report from her personnel file and attached it as documentation of ongoing behavioral problems. By 9 a.m., he had a preliminary file prepared with sufficient institutional weight to ensure that Brooke Sullivan would be removed from the hospital within the day. She was summoned to HR at 10:16 a.m. The meeting was brief. No coffee was offered. No conversation took place. Linda Harmon from Human Resources sat across from her with a printed incident summary, Hargrove's formal complaint, the chain of documentation that had been constructed with the efficiency of someone who had practiced building cases against people he'd decided to destroy. The hospital has a clear protocol regarding emergency procedures and physician authorization, Harmon said, her voice taking on the particular tone of someone reading from a script written by legal counsel. Regardless of the outcome, the procedure was unauthorized. We also have a pattern of incidents documented here. The decision has been made to terminate your employment, effective immediately. Your final paycheck will include payment for today's shift. I understand, Brooke said. Her voice was exactly what it had always been, level, calm, the voice of someone for whom emotional extremity was a luxury she'd learned early not to afford herself. The locker at the hospital smelled like old coffee and the faint residue of various antiseptic cleaners. She removed her personal items in complete silence. The small bag containing her stethoscope. The notebook where she'd sketched patient notes in margins. The photo of the Colorado mountains that someone had given her last year when she'd mentioned liking the view. All of it went into a cardboard box that one of the administrative staff handed to her without meeting her eyes. The third-floor corridor was busy with mid-morning shift change. Staff moved past her without comment, most of them carefully not seeing her, the way workplaces had of erasing someone the moment institutional power decided they were gone. She passed room 347, Marcus Webb's room, and didn't stop. He was in surgery. He would recover. He would heal in a way that was divorced from the person who had saved his life twice, once in a desert 20 years ago, and once more tonight in a way that would erase her from his future. The parking lot was rain-slicked, the early morning drizzle that Denver sometimes wore like a thin shawl. She set the cardboard box in her car and stood for a moment in the damp, her hands at her sides, and allowed herself to feel absolutely nothing at all. The strategy that had kept her alive for 3 years in a quiet apartment in Denver, working nights at a hospital under an assumed identity of ordinariness, had held. But that wasn't the worst part. The phone call started before dawn. Dr. Hargrove sat in his home office in Cherry Creek, mahogany desk gleaming under the desk lamp at 5 in the morning, and dialed Patricia Morehouse, the hospital board chair. She picked up on the third ring, voice thick with sleep. Hargrove didn't apologize for the hour. "We have a serious problem at Mercy General," he said, and the precision in his voice made her wake faster than coffee ever could. "One of our senior nurses, Brooke Sullivan, performed unauthorized emergency procedures on a patient without attending physician authorization. A needle decompression. Tension pneumothorax." He let the medical term sit there, heavy. "She violated protocol, endangered the patient, and when I documented it, she became openly insubordinate. There's a pattern here, Patricia. Concerning patterns of someone who doesn't respect the chain of command." Morehouse listened. Hargrove had cultivated relationships with 3 board members over 7 years, quiet lunches where he praised their judgment, dinners where he mentioned his frustrations with staff who didn't understand the importance of hierarchy. She trusted him. "I'm preparing documentation," he continued. "But I wanted you to hear this from me first. I've never had to escalate anything before. This is serious." The silence on the other end lasted exactly 2 seconds. "Then, send me everything." Hargrove smiled into the darkness of his office. "Already compiled." By 7 in the morning, before the hospital even opened for day shift, Hargrove had emailed Patricia Morehouse a file labeled Sullivan Disciplinary Documentation containing incident reports that stretched back to her first month at Mercy General. Vague complaints about her attitude. Notes about her refusing to acknowledge his seniority in rounds. A photograph of her uniform name tag taken in the break room, which somehow proved nothing but looked damning when attached to a memo about disrespect. He had spent 3 years documenting moments most people wouldn't notice, the way she didn't laugh at his jokes, the way she sometimes made eye contact when speaking to him instead of looking down. Insubordination. Disrespect. Insubordination again. By the time day's shift arrived, Patricia Morehouse had forwarded the file to the other board members. The next call came at 8:15 a.m., this time to the University of Colorado School of Nursing. Hargrove identified himself as medical director of Mercy General and requested Brooke Sullivan's disciplinary records from her nursing program. The registrar hesitated. FERPA laws, privacy protections, student records confidential. Hargrove's voice came through like a knife through water. This is a current employment matter. The nurse in question has performed unauthorized medical procedures and demonstrated a pattern of insubordination. We need documentation of any previous incidents. What Hargrove didn't mention was that he already knew there were no previous incidents. Brooke's file at CU was pristine. Perfect grades, perfect evaluations, a clinical advisor who'd written that she was a natural in crisis situations, calm under pressure, exactly the kind of nurse we need in emergency medicine. But the registrar didn't read him those parts. The registrar, pressured by the medical director of a major hospital system, simply noted the inquiry. A flag on her record. Hargrove then called Brooke's references from her original application, 3 nurses from her previous hospital, a medical school professor she'd worked with during clinical rotations. I'm building a case, he told each of them. Sullivan has become a liability. Has she given you any indication of instability? Inability to follow protocol? Concerning behavior? The nurses heard the weight in his voice and second-guessed their own memories. No one wanted to be associated with a dangerous nurse. No one wanted to be the reference that cleared someone unqualified. They hedged their answers, qualified their praise, and Hargrove recorded every hesitation. By noon, an outside investigator arrived at Mercy General. Her name was Helen Voss, and she'd built a 20-year career investigating hospital staff for liability issues. She was thorough, precise, and she worked exclusively for administrators seeking to build termination cases that wouldn't be challenged. Hargrove met her in a conference room and outlined everything with surgical precision. The unauthorized needle decompression was textbook protocol violation, he began, sliding the patient chart across the table. She should have waited for the attending physician. Instead, she took matters into her own hands. That's dangerous. That's unprofessional. That's grounds for immediate termination. Voss made notes. Anything else? Hargrove smiled slightly. The insubordination. The disrespect to physician authority. The pattern of challenging my clinical decisions in front of staff and patients. He paused, letting the implication settle. I'm concerned about what else she might have done that we haven't documented yet. Voss understood. She spent the next 36 hours conducting interviews. She talked to nurses who'd worked with Brooke and asked leading questions. Has Sullivan ever made you feel uncomfortable with her authority? Has she ever contradicted a doctor's orders? Have you seen her act erratically? The nurses, tired and wanting to cooperate with administration, gave her what she was fishing for. She interviewed residents and medical students. She pulled every medication order Brooke had questioned or flagged for safety concerns, safety flags that had been correct every single time, but framed differently. They looked like a pattern of questioning authority rather than patient advocacy. She constructed an airtight case file that was technically factual but architecturally designed to destroy. 48 hours after the outside investigator's first interview, Brooke received a letter in her mailbox. No warning, no meeting, no chance to respond. It was from Human Resources, signed by Patricia Morehouse, the board chair. Your employment at Mercy General has been terminated, effective immediately, due to pattern of insubordination, unauthorized medical procedures, and violation of hospital protocol. Your final paycheck, including severance, has been deposited into your account. Please return your badge and access credentials. The letter listed everything Hargrove had documented, made it all sound damning, made her sound dangerous. Brooke held the envelope for 3 minutes without opening it, reading the words through the paper as if that would change their meaning. It wouldn't. She knew how this played out. Knew that Hargrove had activated something institutional, something that couldn't be stopped by logic or by the fact that she'd saved a man's life. Hospitals protected their own first. Doctors were priests in white coats, and nurses who challenged them became heretics. She went to the hospital at 4 in the afternoon, during the shift change when the locker rooms were crowded enough that no one would try to talk to her. Her combination was 439. 2 turns left, 3 right, 1 left. The lock popped open like it always did, and inside was her life distilled into a very small space. A photograph of her sister's kids, pinned to the inside of the door with a magnet shaped like a lighthouse. 3 pairs of compression socks. A charger cable. A small notebook where she kept clinical notes when she needed to study pharmacology between shifts. She didn't mention any of it to anyone. Didn't explain. Didn't defend. Didn't tell the nurses who watched her pack that she was a senior chief petty officer, that she'd spent 20 years serving her country, that she'd earned a Navy Cross and 3 Purple Hearts before she'd ever stepped foot in nursing school. Didn't tell them that she'd pulled men from burning vehicles in Kandahar, that she'd performed emergency amputations in the field with nothing but a field kit and training, that she knew how to save lives in ways that made her needle decompression look like kindergarten finger painting. She removed her badge, left it on the break room table, and drove home in silence. The radio played something about redemption. She turned it off. 3 days passed. 3 days of her sitting in her apartment, staring at walls, not answering her phone when her sister called from Boston with her cheerful, oblivious questions about the nursing job. 3 days of wondering if she'd made a terrible mistake, if she should have let Marcus Webb slip away that night, should have waited for Hargrove to arrive, should have let protocol matter more than staying alive. But she hadn't. And now she was fired. And now Hargrove had won. The weight of it felt like drowning. On the 4th day after her termination, Brooke sat in the waiting room of the Denver VA Medical Center for her monthly PTSD appointment. The one she'd never missed in 3 years. The one that kept her tethered to some version of normal. The room was filled with broken people, all of them trying to heal from things that couldn't be healed, only managed. A young Marine sat across from her in dress blues, one leg ending at the knee where prosthetics now began. An older Army veteran argued with the receptionist about medication refills, his voice shaking with frustration. A woman in Air Force utilities studied a pamphlet about sleep hygiene, her hands trembling slightly as she turned the pages. Brooke wore civilian clothes for the first time in 3 years. Jeans and a grey sweater. Hair down instead of pulled back. Trying to disappear into the plastic chairs that smelled like disinfectant and old coffee. She filled out her intake form, previous military service. She checked the box, wrote nothing else in the blank line that asked for details. The truth was somewhere in between every checkbox and every line she left empty. The waiting room television mounted on the wall played news on mute, footage from Yemen, a hostage situation, men in tactical gear being briefed on an operation. Pentagon officials flanked a podium. She watched without really seeing, just something to keep her eyes on instead of the faces of the veterans around her who probably recognized something in her, something that marked her as different from a civilian who'd walked in off the street. Her phone buzzed. A text from her sister in Boston, "How's the nursing job?" Brooke stared at the screen for a long time, then typed back, "Good." Quiet. The lie tasted like ash in her mouth. She'd been quiet her whole life. Quiet got you through basic training, through deployments, through 3 years in Denver where no one knew she'd ever been anything except a hospital nurse. Quiet kept you safe. Quiet kept you invisible. Quiet was the only way she knew how to survive anymore. She stared down at the form in her lap, the mental health assessment, the questions about suicidal ideation, the checkbox about whether she felt unsafe. She wanted to write something honest. Wanted to write that she'd saved a paralyzed veteran's life, that she'd done her job exactly right, that she'd been fired for it anyway, that the only person who'd ever recognized who she really was had been 8 years old 20 years ago. Instead, she checked the box for stable and safe and prepared to lie to her therapist. The waiting room door burst open at exactly 2:40 p.m. Not the regular entrance, the front doors. Both of them. The sound of boots on tile echoed through the space like gunfire. Not a patient. Not another broken person seeking help. Military personnel. For service members in dress uniform, Navy SEALs by the bearing of them, moved through the VA lobby with the kind of controlled authority that made every veteran in the room straighten instinctively. A decorated SEAL commander led them, eyes scanning the space methodically. He was looking for something. Someone. His voice cut through the waiting room like a blade through water. "I'm looking for Senior Chief Sullivan." Phantom 6. Sound off. Every veteran looked up. Brooke's blood turned to ice. She couldn't move. Couldn't breathe. Couldn't do anything except sit absolutely still, as if stillness would make her invisible, as if she could hide from this the way she'd hidden from everything else. From behind the SEAL team, a wheelchair rolled forward. Slow. Deliberate. Marcus Webb. The paralyzed veteran. Still recovering, still in pain, still fighting his way back to anything resembling a life. But here. He pointed directly at Brooke, his voice breaking, "That Senior Chief Petty Officer Sullivan, sir. That's her." The waiting room doors burst open like a breech charge, and the rotor wash from the military convoy outside shook the windows hard enough to rattle the coffee cups on the side table. A decorated SEAL commander strode through in dress blues, his presence moving through the space like a blade cutting through fog, and his voice cut through the waiting room with the precision of someone accustomed to being obeyed immediately. "Senior Chief Sullivan. I'm looking for Senior Chief Sullivan." The room went dead silent. Every veteran's head turned. Every pair of eyes locked on Brooke, who sat in the plastic chair with her hands folded in her lap, the VA intake form half filled on her knees. She didn't move. She didn't blink. She was still wearing the clothes she'd cleaned out of her Mercy General locker in jeans, a grey sweater, the uniform of erasure. Marcus Webb wheeled himself forward from the corner where he'd been waiting for his own appointment, his voice breaking with recognition as he spoke. "That Senior Chief Petty Officer Sullivan, sir. That's her." The SEAL commander's jaw tightened. He nodded once, sharp as a gunshot, and extended his hand toward the chair beside Brooke. A Navy captain emerged from the convoy behind him, holding a manila file folder with both hands like it was made of something fragile. Brooke stood. Slow. Controlled. The way she'd learned to move in rooms full of people with guns pointed at various exits. The captain stepped forward, and his hands were trembling as he opened the file. "Senior Chief Sullivan, I need you to read these. Your deployment orders. Direct authorization from JSOC Command, signed 3 days ago." Brooke's fingers shook as she took the papers. Not from fear. From something else entirely, the weight of a life she'd spent 3 years trying to bury suddenly becoming real on paper again. Her eyes moved across the words, Helmand Province. Hostage extraction. Critical medical specialization required. Operation codename, the Desert Phoenix. 28 personnel. 7-day mission timeline. Immediate departure from Denver International. The SEAL commander's voice rang out across the waiting room, and every word seemed to hit the tile floor like a magazine hitting the ground. Navy Cross for Valor in Helmand Province. Silver Star for saving 16 lives under direct enemy fire. 3 Purple Hearts. He paused. A single breath. Then, the Pentagon doesn't forget its warriors, Senior Chief. And we don't forget the ones who refuse to stay buried. An FBI liaison stepped forward from the group, a woman with a shoulder holster and the kind of focused intensity that came from classified briefings. Agent Maria Torres, FBI Counterterrorism Division. You're being recalled for Operation Desert Phoenix, a critical hostage extraction in the Sistan and Baluchistan region that requires your specific combat medicine credentials and your field experience. There are 3 American operatives currently held, and your medical profile is the only match for the surgical procedures that will be required if extraction goes hot. It wasn't a request. It was a command dressed in bureaucratic language. That was when Dr. Hargrove walked through the waiting room doors. He'd followed her here, 3 days after firing her, probably anticipating the satisfaction of watching her break completely in a public place. He'd come to watch her bottom out. He'd come to confirm that his destruction of her was absolute. Instead, he walked directly into a room full of armed federal personnel, active duty SEALs, and every veteran within sight rising from their plastic chairs in a silent salute. The color drained from his face like someone had pulled a drain plug. Hargrove's mouth opened. Closed. Opened again. Nothing came out. His eyes moved from the Navy captain to the SEAL commander to the FBI agent, and the institutional power he'd wielded so carefully at Mercy General, the board connections, the favors owed, the network of allies, suddenly meant absolutely nothing in a room that operated under federal authority. The same security guard who had handed Brooke her belongings box 3 days earlier emerged from the group. The same man who had watched her humiliation in silence. He approached Hargrove with a cardboard box identical to the one Brooke had carried out, and his voice was flat as a file cabinet. "I believe you know the way out, Doctor." Hargrove took 1 step backward. Then another. His hand reached for his phone, as if calling Patricia Morehouse or some other board connection could undo what was happening in real time. It couldn't. Within hours, the FBI liaison made a phone call to the Department of Defense Inspector General while standing in the Mercy General parking lot. Within 2 hours, the State Nursing Board withdrew the complaint Hargrove had filed. Rachel Chen, the outside consultant he'd hired to build his case against Brooke, sent a single-line email, "Cannot continue professional relationship." The hospital board convened for an emergency session and reviewed Brooke's service record, the Navy cross citation sitting in a classified file that suddenly became very unclassified. The board chair read the words aloud: "Saved 16 lives during a 12-hour siege. Performed combat medicine under direct enemy fire. Refused evacuation until every wounded soldier was stabilized." By that evening, Hargrove's hospital privileges were revoked. His medical license was suspended pending federal investigation. The career he'd built on dominance and institutional leverage collapsed in 4 hours like a house built from patient charts. 6 months later, nurses at Mercy General whispered about seeing him at a community college in Aurora, teaching CPR to high school kids for minimum wage, his voice smaller than anyone remembered, his hands less steady when they demonstrated rescue breathing on a dummy torso. He didn't teach with authority anymore. He taught with the careful precision of someone who had learned, very suddenly, that power was always conditional and that some people had actually been carrying their own the entire time. Brooke stood in the VA waiting room with the deployment orders still in her hands, and something in her chest that had been locked down for 36 months began to open. The SEAL commander nodded once. "Helicopters on the tarmac, Senior Chief. You have 2 hours to grab what you need." She walked to her apartment in northeast Denver with the orders folded in her pocket and stood in the doorway of her bedroom looking at the pair of worn combat boots sitting under the bed where she'd buried them 3 years ago. Scuffed leather. Laces tied in the specific way that only came from muscle memory. The boots smelled like diesel exhaust and mortar dust and the particular kind of sand that got into everything in Helmand Province and never fully came out. Brooke knelt down. She reached for them slowly. She unlaced them. She laced them again with the same precision she used when tying off surgical knots. She stood. She felt the weight settle across her feet and ankles like an entire identity clicking back into place, not erasing the nurse, not dismissing the 3 years of quiet healing work, but finally merging the 2 versions of herself that had been trying to exist separately. The helicopter blades beat overhead as she walked across the tarmac at Denver International, and the rotor wash whipped her hair back from her face. The SEAL commander saluted as she approached. The captain nodded with something like awe. 28 soldiers stood in formation, and every single one of them understood what they were looking at, a warrior who had spent 3 years trying to be invisible finally stepping back into the light. Brooke Sullivan, Senior Chief Petty Officer, boarded the aircraft that would carry her back to Helmand Province, back to the work that had shaped her, back to the only war that had ever truly made sense. The boots hit the metal floor of the helicopter with a sound like coming home. The doors sealed. The engines roared. And she was gone. Not all heroes wear capes. Some wear scrubs. And some wear both, just not at the same time. If you loved Brooke's story, hit subscribe and let us know in the comments, what would you have done in her position? Have you ever been underestimated by someone who had no idea who they were standing next to? And if the Pentagon called your workplace tonight, would you get on the helicopter?